The atmosphere in courtroom number 4 did not carry its usual solemnity. It was thick with disgust, like the way people look at a strange creature dragged out of a sewer. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the man hunched over in the defendant's chair. Thomas the blind widower sat there, swallowed by the vast, cold space of the law. He wore a cheap pair of dark glasses, one side of the frame cracked and clumsily taped back together. His thin, calloused hands were gripping a white mobility cane, trembling repeatedly as if it were his only lifeline. He had no lawyer. He had refused that right. Facing him, on the opposite side of the battlefield, was Eleanor, his late wife's sister, elegant in a custom-designed dress, radiating expensive perfume and undisguised contempt. "Your Honor, I do not wish to waste the court's time with hollow accusations," Eleanor's lawyer said as he stood up, his voice sharp as a razor. He held a remote control and pointed it straight at the large screen hanging in the center of the courtroom. A grainy black and white video appeared, extracted from a New York subway station's security camera. The timestamp in the corner read 1:15 a.m. The entire courtroom held its breath. In the video, Thomas was sitting slumped on the filthy tiled floor, playing an old violin. In front of him was an empty box meant for loose change. And beside him was Sophie. The child was only 5 years old. Small, swallowed up by an oversized adult coat. Suddenly, a large, drunken man appeared in the frame. He staggered toward Thomas and raised his foot, preparing to kick the violin case. What happened next sent a chill through the entire courtroom. Thomas had no idea the danger was approaching. He continued playing, immersed in his eternal darkness. But Sophie was different. The little girl did not cry. She did not retreat behind her blind father in fear. She did not scream for help. In a split second, Sophie rushed forward, positioning herself between the massive man and her blind father. She planted her feet firmly apart, raised her right hand and pointed straight at the man's face, chin lifted in defiance. Her mouth shouted something. The video had no sound, but Sophie's body language radiated a terrifying threat. It did not look like the reflex of a child. It looked like an alpha beast defending its territory. The large man froze. He looked at the child, then stepped back 1 step, 2 steps and finally turned around and walked away. Eleanor's lawyer pressed pause. The screen froze on the moment Sophie was pointing at her attacker, her eyes in the video glowing with a frightening ferocity. "What are you seeing here?" the lawyer asked the jury, his voice lowered dramatically. "A dutiful daughter protecting her father? No." He walked toward Thomas and slammed a thick folder onto the table, making Thomas flinch. "This is not parenting, Your Honor," the lawyer snarled, pointing at the screen. "This is training. He is not raising a daughter. He is using this 5-year-old child as a living shield, a tool for survival to compensate for his own uselessness." Whispers erupted like a disturbed beehive. The looks directed at Thomas shifted from pity to outrage. How could a father allow his child to face danger like that in the middle of the night? Judge Harrison banged his gavel, calling for order. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at Thomas with a mix of severity and curiosity. "Defendant," the judge said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "Do you have any explanation for your actions in this video? Why did you allow a 5-year-old child to stand in front of you against a dangerous individual?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Eleanor smirked, certain that Thomas would invent some clumsy excuse about paternal love. But Thomas kept his head lowered. His shoulders trembled violently. He did not stand up, nor did he lift his head to look toward the judge. His lips moved. The sound that came out was hoarse and weak, yet perfectly audible in the absolute silence. "That was my fault." Eleanor stiffened. Her lawyer frowned. Everyone stared in confusion. Thomas clenched his cane so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He took a deep breath, as if trying to swallow a bitter lump stuck in his throat. "The lawyer is right," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "I am a burden. I do not deserve to be her father." Thomas did not argue. He did not say that he loved his daughter. He confessed immediately, an acceptance far too quick, far too easy, and deeply abnormal. Judge Harrison narrowed his eyes. He had presided over thousands of cases, and his instincts told him this: the blind man's confession was not simple remorse. It sounded like a lie meant to conceal another horrifying truth. "Statement noted," the judge said slowly, his gaze never leaving Thomas. "But this trial is not over yet. Call the next witness, Sophie." Sophie walked up to the stand. She was far too small for the massive leather-upholstered witness chair. A court officer stepped forward, intending to lift her up, but Sophie raised her hand, signaling him to stop. She climbed up by herself, quick and decisive, like a small squirrel accustomed to scaling subway barriers. Once seated, her legs dangled in the air, not reaching the floor. She looked like an angel from a painting, golden hair, large round blue eyes. But when Sophie looked up at Judge Harrison, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Those were not the eyes of a 5-year-old child. There was no innocence in them, no fear, no childish curiosity. They were flat and ancient, like a frozen lake that had witnessed too many brutal winters. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, trying to soften his authoritative voice as much as possible. He wanted to play the role of a kind grandfather, someone who would rescue this poor child from a dark life on the streets. "Hello, Sophie," the judge smiled, removing his glasses to appear friendlier. "You don't need to be afraid. No one here will hurt you. I just want to ask you a few questions." Sophie did not smile back. She looked at him, then briefly glanced at Thomas sitting with his head lowered in the distance, before her gaze stopped on Eleanor. A look sharp as a razor. "I know who you are," Sophie said, her voice clear but her tone flat and emotionless. "You're the man holding the wooden hammer. You decide whether tonight I sleep at home or sleep in a shelter." The courtroom erupted in astonished gasps. Judge Harrison froze for several seconds. "You're very smart," he nodded, struggling to maintain his smile. "But today, we won't talk about that just yet. Your Aunt Eleanor, she misses you very much. She has prepared a special gift to welcome you." At the judge's signal, Eleanor's lawyer stepped forward and respectfully placed a large, already opened gift box on the table in front of Sophie. Inside was a beautiful French porcelain doll. Its curled hair was meticulously styled, its lace dress elaborate and beaded with sparkle, its polished leather shoes gleaming, a luxurious toy that any little girl would dream of. Eleanor sat below, wearing a triumphant, sweet smile. She was certain that the moment the poor child touched the doll, the hard shell would crack, and Sophie would begin to long for a life of luxury by her side. Sophie looked at the doll. She did not squeal with delight. She did not hug it tightly either. Instead, Sophie picked the doll up with one hand. Her gesture was not affectionate at all. She turned the doll upside down, lifted its skirt to check the fabric label sewn inside, then used her tiny finger to press firmly on the joints of the doll's arms and legs. She narrowed her eyes, carefully inspecting the stitching along the hem of the dress. That action looked exactly like a seasoned pawnshop owner appraising the value of an item, not like a child receiving a gift. "Don't you like it?" Judge Harrison asked, confusion clearly visible on his face. "Aunt Eleanor said she has an entire room full of dolls like this just for you." Sophie placed the doll down on the table. A dry clack sound echoed. She brushed her hands off, as if she had just touched something dirty. Sophie lifted her head and looked straight into Judge Harrison's eyes with a seriousness that sent chills down one's spine. "It's useless," Sophie said firmly. "What?" The judge was stunned. "This doll," Sophie pointed at the expensive toy, "doesn't know how to warn me when it's about to rain. It doesn't know how to tell the difference between a car horn and an ambulance siren. It also doesn't know how to count change to see whether there's enough money to buy bread today." She pushed the doll toward Eleanor's lawyer, her eyes completely devoid of emotion. I don't need things that don't help me survive. You tell her to keep it and play with it herself. The silence that enveloped the courtroom at that moment was more terrifying than when the video had been played. People looked at one another, goosebumps rising all over their arms. Eleanor frowned and whispered to her lawyer loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "He has destroyed the child's soul. She is no longer a child. She's a machine." Judge Harrison stared at Sophie, the unease in his heart growing stronger. Her answer was not merely a rejection of a toy, it was a declaration of a brutal worldview he could never have imagined. What had this child gone through to regard innocence as useless? "Sophie," the judge asked, his voice lowering, full of scrutiny. "Who taught you these things? Was it your father?" Sophie shook her head. She glanced at Thomas once more. The blind father sat motionless like a statue, but his hand gripping the cane tightened. "No one taught me," Sophie replied lightly. "Those are the rules of the street. If something has no use, don't keep it. It only makes your bag heavier." That answer, reeking of practicality and survival, struck everyone in the room like a heavy blow. Eleanor might think she was gaining the upper hand by proving Sophie was abnormal, but deep down, the crowd's growing curiosity made her uneasy. This was not an ordinary custody dispute. The child sitting on the witness stand was concealing an intellect so sharp and thorny it was terrifying. And if Thomas had not taught her these things, then who had? Or what had turned a 5-year-old angel into such an aged entity? As the courtroom sank into confusion after Sophie's ruthlessly practical response, Eleanor suddenly jumped to her feet. Her feigned composure cracked. She could not tolerate a 5-year-old child, dressed in shabby clothes, daring to reject her expensive gift in front of so many people. "Your Honor, you see it now," Eleanor cried out, her voice shooting upward, trembling with rage while trying to disguise itself as heartbreak. "This is the consequence of letting the child live on the streets. She speaks like an uncultured person. Thomas doesn't even teach her basic manners, let alone proper education." She pointed at Thomas, her eyes burning with contempt. "He is blind, Your Honor. He cannot read books to her. He cannot teach her how to write. Sophie is 5 years old and probably doesn't even know the alphabet. She needs tutors, she needs school, she needs culture, not the petty survival tricks of homeless people." Eleanor's accusations pierced the tense atmosphere like needles. The crowd began to nod. No matter how clever Sophie was, education was still the foundation. What future could an illiterate child have in New York? Judge Harrison lightly struck the gavel, signaling Eleanor to sit down. He turned back to Sophie, his expression more serious. Education was a key factor in custody cases. "Sophie," the judge asked thoughtfully, "do you know any letters in this law book?" He held up the thick law volume. Sophie remained silent. She did not look at the book. Her deep blue eyes shifted, looking straight at Eleanor's lawyer, then at Eleanor, and finally resting on the judge. A gaze filled with evaluation, as if she were deciding whether these adults were worthy of her words. Thomas, in the distance, stirred slightly. He seemed about to say something to stop her, but then refrained. Then Sophie spoke. But the sound that came out was not English. "That's ridiculous. That woman speaks too loudly to hide her insecurity," Sophie said. The entire courtroom froze. It was French. And not the halting French memorized from children's television programs. Her voice flowed smoothly, with precise intonation, astonishingly accurate, just like a true Parisian lady complaining about noise. Judge Harrison blinked repeatedly, unable to believe his ears. Eleanor stood there with her mouth agape. She prided herself on having lived in Paris for many years, yet she had not even fully grasped that fluent sentence. Before anyone could recover, Sophie continued. This time she looked at the court clerk who had stopped typing in shock. "It's not necessary to write everything. The truth is in the silence," Sophie said next. "Italian. Deep, melodic, and philosophical. Then she turned to look at Thomas, before delivering a clear, decisive line in Japanese. "I will protect my father. No one can hurt him." 2. The silence that engulfed the courtroom was no longer confusion. It was total shock. A 5-year-old child, accused of being uneducated and illiterate, had just spoken 3 foreign languages fluently in less than a minute. What nonsense is the child saying? Or was she drilled with meaningless phrases? Eleanor's lawyer stammered, dropping his pen. Judge Harrison, who had once worked at a consulate, narrowed his eyes at Sophie. He understood some French. The first sentence she had spoken was not meaningless. "What did you just say in French, Sophie?" the judge asked, his voice wavering with astonishment. Sophie shrugged, her expression calm, as if none of this were a big deal. "I said, that's ridiculous. This woman speaks too loudly to hide her insecurity," Sophie translated, her eyes still fixed on Eleanor. Eleanor's face flushed red with both humiliation and rage. "Who taught you?" the judge pressed. "Did your father teach you?" "No," Sophie replied. "Dad only taught me how to listen. I listened to tourists in Times Square. I listened to models talking in cafes near Fifth Avenue when they thought no one could understand them." The answer sent a chill down everyone's spine. This child was a gigantic sponge, absorbing every sound of the world around her. But the decisive blow had not yet come. Sophie suddenly climbed down from the chair and took a few steps toward Eleanor's table. She pointed at the bright orange designer handbag that Eleanor had carelessly placed on the table, the symbol of wealth and status that the woman used to flaunt in court. "Aunt Eleanor," Sophie said in English, her childish voice sharp as a blade, "you always scold my dad for being poor. Then why are you using a fake bag?" Eleanor jumped, quickly grabbing the bag. "What nonsense are you talking about? This is a genuine Hermes Birkin. I bought it in Paris." Sophie tilted her head. A faint smile appeared on her lips, a smile that made people shudder because of its maturity. "No, it isn't," Sophie said calmly. "I heard 2 French women talking at the bakery last week. They said that on a real Hermes bag, the stitching on the handle tilts 18 degrees to the left. But on your bag, the stitching is perfectly straight. And the smell of the leather on your bag, it smells like plastic, like that doll just now." The little girl turned to the judge and delivered a final line that made Eleanor want the ground to swallow her whole. "They said that people who use bags like this are usually people who try to look rich to hide their debts. Is that true?" 100 debts. The entire courtroom erupted. Suppressed giggles came from the spectator benches. Eleanor froze, her face drained of all color, her trembling hands clutching the handbag as if trying to conceal incriminating evidence. The arrogance and glamorous facade of the upper class had just been mercilessly stripped away by an illiterate child using nothing but observation and extraordinary hearing. Judge Harrison looked at Sophie, then at Thomas. He realized this case was far more complicated than he had thought. Sophie did not merely know foreign languages. She understood culture, understood hypocrisy, and most importantly, she possessed a pair of eyes that could see straight into people's hearts, eyes forged by a harsh life beside a blind father. The mocking laughter aimed at Eleanor gradually died down, but the atmosphere in the courtroom did not grow lighter. On the contrary, it shifted into a new tension, admiration shrouded in suspicion. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and wiped them gently with the edge of his black robe. He had been impressed by Sophie's exposure just moments ago, but the instincts of a man who weighed justice told him something was wrong. A 5-year-old could pick up French or Italian from passers-by, but Sophie's behavior in the initial video, the way she planted her stance, pointed, and shouted, carried an entirely different quality. "Sophie," Judge Harrison said, his voice hardening. "You said you learned languages by listening to people talk. Very smart. But let's return to the original video." He pointed at the dark screen hanging on the wall. "Earlier, What language did you speak to that man? And what did you say? Sophie pressed her lips together. Her small shoulders stiffened slightly. The confidence she had shown while mocking Eleanor's fake bag vanished, replaced by extreme caution. She turned her head to look toward her father. Thomas, though unable to see anything, seemed to sense the heat of the question. He shook his head slightly, a micro gesture almost no one noticed, but Sophie did. He was begging her not to speak. She turned back, took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and looked straight at Judge Harrison. That was Chinese, sir, Sophie answered. Her voice became firm, echoing through the silent courtroom. What did you say? The judge asked. Sophie stood up on the witness stand. She was no longer a child answering questions. She was reenacting a moment of life and death. Her body tensed, her eyes blazing as she stared into the undefined space in front of her. I said, if you take one more step, an undercover cop at the 3 o'clock position will grab you immediately. The money in this box has already been marked. Get lost. Money in the States. The entire courtroom fell silent. Eleanor's mouth dropped open, her hand loosening its grip on the designer bag. Marked money? Judge Harrison frowned, utterly shocked. Who taught you to lie so professionally? No one taught me. That's the only way to make them afraid. Sophie replied instantly, without hesitation. Chinese men in Brooklyn are very strong, but they're afraid of undercover cops. Before the judge could process that information, Sophie continued. She seemed to fall into a hypnotic state, where street memories flooded her young mind. And if it's in a Thai neighborhood, I use Thai. Sophie said quickly, her voice turning rapid and urgent, as if racing against time. She shouted a string of Thai phrases, her hands waving in warning gestures. Watch out. Pickpocket behind you. Hold the violin tight. Don't let him touch you. Then she switched to another tone, harsher and colder Russian, followed by a short Arabic sentence, blunt and clipped like a military command. Step back. Danger. Don't touch my father. Run. Each sentence fired from Sophie's mouth like a bullet. There were no hello, no, thank you, no, my name is Sophie. Every single one was an order, a threat, a warning, or a command to drive someone away. Judge Harrison felt icy cold all over. He looked at the 5-year-old child before him and no longer saw a linguistic prodigy worthy of admiration. He saw a soldier. That's enough. The judge raised his hand to stop her, his voice trembling with emotion. Sophie stopped. She exhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling. The fierce look vanished, replaced by an ancient, emotionless calm. That's what I learned, Sophie said, her voice returning to a painfully neutral tone. You ask me what I learned it for? I learned it to do this. Number 4 man. She raised her small arms, making a shielding gesture. Dad can't see them coming. He only hears footsteps. But the footsteps of someone giving money and the footsteps of a robber sound very similar, Sophie explained, enunciating every word clearly. I have to use their language to scare them. If I speak English, they'll know I'm a weak local kid. But if I speak the language of their gang, they'll hesitate. 1 second of hesitation is enough for me to pull Dad and run. The naked truth shattered the space. The 15 languages Sophie knew were not an educational achievement. They were armor. They were weapons. They were the fortress that this child built herself from the fragments of society to protect her defenseless blind father. Eleanor sat frozen in her seat. She had wanted to prove Sophie was uneducated, but she had accidentally dragged into the light something far more horrifying. Sophie had graduated from the school of life with top honors as a street bodyguard. Judge Harrison looked at Thomas. The blind father was now slumped over the table, both hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking violently. Defendant, the judge called, his voice no longer sharp but filled with painful doubt and pity. You, how long have you known about this? You? The judge's question hung in the air, shifting everyone's attention from the extraordinary child to the helpless father. Why would a father allow his child to become such a solitary warrior? Was it cruelty, or utter helplessness? As the truth about Sophie's language armor finished unfolding, the courtroom erupted like a delayed time bomb. The initial murmurs quickly turned into a wave of open outrage. Eleanor's lawyer seized this golden opportunity. He rushed to the center of the room, pointing straight at Thomas's face as if trying to pierce the blind man's body. Abuse. This is clearly psychological abuse, Your Honor, he shouted, his face flushed red. We thought he was a pitiful disabled father, but no. He's a parasite. He turned his own daughter into a bodyguard, into a living shield, so he could sit comfortably and play the violin to make money. Eleanor also jumped to her feet, lifting a handkerchief to dab at her tears that now seemed more justified than ever. She's only 5 years old. Eleanor sobbed, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion. While other children are learning ballet, playing with dolls, my niece has to learn street slang from the criminal underworld just to protect her father. Your Honor, he is not raising the child. He is imprisoning her inside his own misery. The noise rose so high that Judge Harrison had to strike the gavel repeatedly, the sharp sound echoing throughout the room. Order. I demand order. When the reluctant silence returned, all eyes turned toward the defendant's seat. Thomas was still sitting there, his head lowered more than ever. His frail shoulders trembled uncontrollably, he looked small and pitifully alone. Then, Thomas slowly stood up. He raised his calloused hand and deliberately removed the cheap black sunglasses. For the first time since the beginning of the trial, his face was fully exposed under the cold neon lights. His eyes were cloudy, covered by a lifeless white film, unfocused. Yet from those useless eye sockets, tears were spilling out, rolling down his gaunt cheeks. He did not turn toward the lawyer accusing him. He faced the direction of the judge's gavel. They're right, Thomas spoke. His voice was hoarse and broken, carrying the pain of a man who had been stripped of his last shred of dignity. The entire courtroom froze. Had he just confessed? What did you say? Judge Harrison asked again, his voice lowering. I am a burden, Thomas repeated, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. I never wanted her to become my bodyguard. Never. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress the sob caught in his throat. Your Honor, do you know how many times I tried to send her away? 3 times. I sent her to public school number 4. I sent her to the nuns at St. Mary's Church. I even once secretly left her at a social welfare shelter while she was asleep. And what happened? The judge asked. Thomas smiled bitterly, a twisted smile. She ran back. Every time. The nuns said they couldn't keep her. She refused to eat, refused to sleep. She clawed at the doors until her fingernails bled. She found me, in the sea of people at the subway station, just by my music. If you are docked to this wust. He paused, turning his head toward where Sophie was sitting, though he could not see her. There was one time, when she was only 3 years old, I told her to go buy bread at the shop across the street. While she was gone, 2 young men came. They took all the money from my violin case. They shoved me to the ground and smashed my violin. The courtroom was deathly silent. No one dared to breathe loudly. When Sophie came back, Thomas's voice choked. He had to stop for several seconds to regain control. When she came back and saw me lying there, my face swollen, my hands bleeding, fumbling to pick up the broken pieces of wood. She didn't cry. She threw the bread away. She hugged my legs and swore. She swore in a voice that was not a child's. Thomas swallowed with difficulty. She said, from now on, no one is allowed to touch Dad anymore. I will be Dad's eyes. And from that night on, she started learning. She learned how to listen to footsteps, learned how to curse, learned how to threaten. I forbade her, I begged her to stop. But she said that if I sent her away, she would sit at the subway entrance until she died. Thomas lifted his face, turning his lifeless blind eyes toward the judge, his voice shifting from anguish to resolve. Your Honor, the lawyer is right. I am a parasite. I am eroding my daughter's childhood. My presence is a life sentence for Sophie. I cannot protect her, on the contrary, I force her to grow up too soon to protect me. Eleanor sat below, her eyes wide with shock. She had prepared countless pieces of evidence to fight for custody, but she never expected victory to arrive this way. Thomas released his grip on the table. He stood upright, though his legs were still trembling. I agree with Mrs. Eleanor's request, Thomas declared, each word like a knife stabbing into his own heart. Take her away. Take her to a place with dolls, with schools, with expensive handbags. Don't let her stay in the gutter with me anymore. Why you are voluntarily giving up custody? Judge Harrison asked, unable to hide his surprise. That is not giving up, Your Honor, Thomas whispered, lowering his head. That is liberation. I am setting her free. The silence in the room was heavy as lead. Everyone looked at Thomas differently now. There was no more contempt, only suffocating pity. He was not an exploiter. He was a father who loved his child enough to sever with his own hands the only bond left in his life, willing to condemn himself to eternal loneliness so his daughter could step into the light. Eleanor smiled triumphantly and nodded to her lawyer. She had won. Thomas had surrendered. But they had forgotten one person. One person who had never accepted anyone arranging her fate, whether it was a judge, a wealthy aunt, or even the father she worshipped. On the witness stand, Sophie slowly stood up. The icy indifference was gone from her blue eyes. They were now blazing with fury. Thomas's confession felt like a tragic full stop to the trial. The space sank into the heaviness of a family tragedy no one wished to witness. Eleanor had won, but her victory carried the bitter taste of cruelty. Judge Harrison sighed, removed his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at Thomas with deep compassion. A father willing to sacrifice his parental rights so his child could have a better future, that was the most legitimate reason for the court to issue a ruling. He picked up the wooden gavel, preparing to strike it down to formalize the separation. The court acknowledges the defendant Thomas's voluntary consent, the judge said in a low, sorrowful voice. In the best interest of the child, I rule that guardianship shall be transferred to Mrs. Eleanor. No. The shout tore through the stillness. It was not a cry of pleading, it was the roar of a small beast driven into a corner. Judge Harrison jerked, the gavel freezing in midair. Sophie had climbed fully onto the witness stand table. She stood there, hands on her hips, her blazing eyes glaring at Eleanor, then turning to her father with utter disappointment. Dad, you're an idiot. Sophie shouted, her voice echoing throughout the courtroom. Do you think Aunt wants to raise me? Do you think she cares what I eat or where I sleep? Thomas panicked, flailing his hands in the air. Sophie. Get down right now. Don't be disrespectful. I'm not getting down. Sophie stomped her foot on the table, producing a sharp crack. She pointed her tiny finger straight at Eleanor's face, Eleanor, who had gone pale with shock. Tell him. Sophie snarled, her sharp gaze drilling into her aunt. Tell the judge why you're so determined to take me. Is it because you love me? Or because you hate my dad? Why you? What are you talking about? Eleanor stammered, her earlier confidence completely gone. I want what's best for you. Lies. Sophie cut in, her voice icy, laying bare the naked truth. You hate my dad because Mom chose him back then. Mom left that rich business partner you introduced to follow my dad. You always said my dad was the biggest mistake of Mom's life. You want to take me away just to prove that you were right and that Mom was wrong. The entire courtroom erupted in shock. Eleanor stood frozen, her mouth open but no words coming out. A family secret, the dark motive hidden behind the glamorous facade of charity, had just been mercilessly stripped bare by a 5-year-old child. Sophie did not stop there. She spun around toward Judge Harrison, her gaze so resolute that it made him shiver. "Judge," Sophie said firmly. "You can bang that gavel. You can sign that paper. You can order the police to take me back to Aunt Eleanor's mansion in Connecticut. But listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." She took a deep breath, and the words that followed sent a chill down everyone's spine. "I know the last train from Connecticut to New York leaves at 11:45 p.m. I know how to slip past the ticket gates at Grand Central without being caught by security. I know that in Central Park, the ventilation duct behind the boathouse is the warmest place to sleep overnight without freezing to death." Judge Harrison was stunned. "Sophie, are you threatening the court?" "I'm not threatening," Sophie replied, strangely calm. "I'm informing you of my plan. If you force me away from my dad, I will run away. I will run away the very first night. Aunt Eleanor can lock the doors, but she's not smarter than me. I've been climbing walls since I was 3. She stepped to the edge of the table and looked straight into the judge's eyes. "I will walk. I will jump trains. I will sleep on the streets. I will do it every day, every night, until I find my dad. You can catch me 100 times, I will escape 101 times." Thomas collapsed onto the table, sobbing silently. "Sophie, don't do this. There are warm blankets there, good food." "I don't need warm blankets," Sophie shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks, yet her voice remained unyielding. "I need Dad, don't you understand? Dad is not my burden. Dad is my mission. If I'm not there, who will read the signs for him? Who will tell him the light has turned green? Who will chase the bad people away?" She turned to Eleanor and gave her a faint, contemptuous smile. "You can buy me expensive dolls, but dolls don't breathe. Dolls don't play the violin so I can sleep. You have all the money in the world, but you are lonely, Aunt Eleanor. You look at me like a defective piece of jewelry that needs fixing. But Dad looks at me with his ears, with his heart." Sophie jumped down from the table and ran to hug Thomas's legs tightly, then looked up toward the judge's bench. That image, a tiny child spreading her arms to protect her blind, towering yet fragile father, was more powerful than any defense. "Judge," Sophie said, her voice softer but still heavy with weight. "You say you want what's best for me. But if you separate me from my dad, you won't be saving me. You'll be pushing me toward death. Because I would rather starve at a train station beside my dad than live like a soulless doll in her castle." The silence that fell over the courtroom was completely different now. There was no more judgment, no more suspicion. Only reverence and a vague, creeping fear. Everyone realized this was not a manipulated child. This was an ancient soul, a warrior angel, who had chosen her own mission. And no power, no court ruling, could break that will. Judge Harrison set the gavel down on the desk. His hand trembled slightly. He looked into Sophie's resolute eyes and understood that her threat was real. If he separated them, he would be responsible for the next tragedy when this child wandered alone through the night searching for her father. "Recess for 10 minutes, the judge said hoarsely. "I need to think." 10 minutes passed. The judge returned. "Thomas, I want to ask you one question," Judge Harrison said, his voice lowered. "With blind eyes, what can you possibly teach your daughter?" Thomas did not answer immediately. He lifted the violin and gently placed it on his left shoulder. His gesture was skilled and reverent, as if he were holding a living being, not an inanimate object. "I can't teach her to distinguish the colors in a Van Gogh painting like Miss Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice light yet strangely resonant. "I also can't show her the beauty of the Eiffel Tower or the cobblestone streets of Rome. But I teach her to hear the colors of the wind." "The colors of the wind?" Eleanor snorted. "Ridiculous." "And the colors of the human heart," Thomas added, this time directing his clouded eyes straight at Eleanor. making her shudder into silence. "Sophie," Thomas called softly. "Yes, Dad," Sophie replied. She stood still beside his leg and closed her eyes tightly. No one told her to do so, but it seemed to be a private ritual between father and daughter. When physical eyes closed, another pair opened. "Tell them what you see," Thomas whispered. He drew the bow. A sharp, cold sound rang out, not a gentle, melodic tune, but the screech of strings rubbing together, mimicking the wind howling through subway grates, hurried footsteps, blaring car horns. It was chaotic and jagged. Judge Harrison frowned. He did not understand. "What do you see?" the judge asked Sophie. Sophie kept her eyes closed, her head slightly tilted toward the ceiling, her body swaying gently to the chaotic rhythm of the music. "I see gray," Sophie's voice sounded, dreamy yet clear. "The gray of wet concrete. A man wearing hard-soled shoes. He's in a hurry. He just dropped a coin but didn't turn back to pick it up because he's afraid of being late for a meeting." Thomas's music suddenly changed. It became warmer, fuller, the notes dancing like rays of sunlight. "And now?" Thomas asked through the music. "Orange-yellow," Sophie smiled, a rare, innocent smile. "The smell of warm bread." An old woman just walked by. She stopped. She didn't give money, but she put an apple into the violin case. "She's smiling because she just received a letter from her grandson." The entire courtroom fell silent. Eleanor frowned, about to object that this was just a trick. But Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. He abruptly shifted tone. The melody became deep, aching, and heartbreakingly sorrowful. The violin wept, stretched out like suppressed sobbing in the night. It was no longer the sound of the streets. It was the sound of inner life. Thomas was not playing any formal piece. He was reading the atmosphere in the room and transforming it into sound. He turned his body, aiming the violin toward the judge's bench. Sophie shuddered slightly. She took a deep breath, her small brows knitting together. "Sophie," Judge Harrison asked, his voice faltering as an invisible unease crept into his heart. "What do you see?" Sophie did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained closed, but her face turned directly toward where the judge was sitting. "I see, dark blue," Sophie whispered. "It's very cold." "What is cold?" the judge asked, his hand unconsciously tightening on the armrest. "A large room," Sophie continued, her voice suddenly aged and strangely compassionate. "So many books. There's a fireplace, but the fire went out a long time ago. There's a velvet armchair, but no one is sitting in it." Thomas's violin grew shrill, aching like a question with no answer. "He is sitting there," Sophie said, suddenly opening her eyes wide and staring straight at Judge Harrison. "He is looking out the window. It's raining. He is waiting for a red car, but it will never come." "Stop!" Judge Harrison shouted, his face drained of all color. He sprang to his feet, knocking over the glass of water on his desk. The entire courtroom was frozen in shock. Eleanor stared at the judge in horror, then looked at Sophie. Judge Harrison was gasping for breath, clutching his chest. The most painful secret of his life, his daughter who ran away in a red car on a stormy night 10 years ago and never returned, had just been laid bare by a strange child. He had never told this story to anyone. No newspaper knew. Even the court clerk who had worked there for 5 years did not know. Thomas lowered the violin. The music stopped abruptly, returning absolute silence. "How?" Judge Harrison stammered, his voice breaking. "How did you know?" "My father didn't teach me to read words in books, sir," Sophie said, her voice gentle but each word cutting deep. "My father taught me to read what people don't say. He said that sadness has its own sound. Your breathing. It's heavy, just like my father's breathing on rainy nights when he misses my mother." Judge Harrison slowly sat back down in his chair. He removed his glasses and covered his eyes with his hand. His fingers were soaked. The truth was laid bare. Thomas had not trained a bodyguard or a wild beast. He had nurtured an extraordinary level of empathy, an ability to read the human heart that no school could ever teach. Thomas had turned his disability into an invaluable gift for his daughter, an understanding of humanity. Eleanor sat there, completely defeated. She had money, power, and glamour. But before the invisible eyes of the father and daughter, she was nothing more than an empty shell. Judge Harrison remained seated for a long time after Thomas's violin fell completely silent. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a verdict that would decide the fate of these two extraordinary people. He looked down at Thomas the blind man with frail shoulders but a great soul, then looked at Sophie the 5-year-old child carrying the maturity of a warrior and the heart of an angel. Finally, the judge picked up the wooden gavel. His hand was no longer trembling. "In my 30 years on the bench," Judge Harrison began, his voice resonant yet heavy with emotion, "I have ruled on thousands of divorces and hundreds of custody disputes. I have always believed that money and stability are the best foundations for a child." He paused and turned to look at Eleanor. She was sitting there with her head lowered, her hands gripping tightly the luxury handbag that Sophie had exposed as a fake. "But today," the judge continued, "this court has witnessed another kind of asset. An asset not measured by banks, but by empathy and the ability to survive. Your Honor, but he," Eleanor's lawyer tried to stand up in a weak objection. "Sit down." The judge barked, his eyes cold. "I am not finished." He turned back to Thomas and Sophie. "The defendant Thomas admits that he is a burden. But from what I have seen, you are not a burden. You are an anchor. You have taught your daughter the most important lesson that no school can teach, how to see the truth in a world full of lies." Judge Harrison raised the gavel high and brought it down with a decisive strike. Bang! "The court rejects Mrs. Eleanor's petition for custody of Sophie," he declared firmly. The entire gallery erupted in gasps, scattered applause breaking out and then spreading into a full, resounding round of clapping. Eleanor stood frozen, her face drained of all color. However, the judge raised his hand for silence. "I have one condition." He pointed at Eleanor. "Mrs. Eleanor, you said you want to take care of your niece's future, correct? Very well. The court orders you to establish an educational trust fund of $500,000 for Sophie. This money shall be used for the child's education whenever she wishes, at any school she chooses." "What?" Eleanor jumped to her feet, her voice hissing. "I have to pay, but I don't get to raise her." "You're insane." Judge Harrison shrugged coldly. Eleanor went numb. She knew she had lost. Lost everything to a blind man and a child. Judge Harrison turned to Sophie, his gaze softening, tinged with the quiet sorrow of a father who missed his own child. "Sophie, you will go home with your father. But promise me one thing." "What is it?" Sophie asked, her blue eyes fixed intently on him. "Whenever you need anything, call me." Sophie nodded, a crisp nod like a soldier receiving orders. "Yes, sir." The trial was over. Outside the New York courthouse, rain began to pour. Heavy drops lashed against the asphalt, reflecting the glow of neon lights. Thomas put his old black sunglasses back on. He stood on the courthouse steps, gripping his white cane tightly, slightly hunched from the cold. Sophie stood beside him, small but steady. Eleanor stepped out behind them, shielded by her bodyguard's umbrella. She stopped and looked at the father and daughter with a complex expression, part envy, part contempt, and also a hint of fear. "You will regret this, Sophie," Eleanor called out, her voice half drowned out by the rain. Sophie did not turn around. She adjusted her father's coat collar, then stepped down the stairs ahead of him. She did not hold her father's hand to lead him like other children. She walked exactly 3 steps ahead of Thomas. Snap! Sophie snapped her fingers. A sharp, clean sound cut through the patter of rain. Thomas immediately followed, the toe of his shoe landing precisely where the snap had sounded. He did not need to see, he trusted that sound completely. Snap. Another snap to the left, signaling a puddle to avoid. Thomas smoothly shifted left. The father and daughter moved through the New York rain like a perfectly programmed machine. No wasted words. Only the guiding snaps and the rhythmic tapping of the cane. As they were about to merge into the crowded intersection, Sophie suddenly stopped. She looked up at the gray sky, then toward the luxurious skyscrapers where Eleanor lived. She pulled a battered old toy walkie-talkie from her coat pocket, something everyone had assumed was trash. She lifted it to her mouth and spoke into the empty air in a coded language known only to the two of them, her voice cold and alert. Alpha secure. Target eliminated. Let's go home, Daddy. Thomas smiled the most peaceful smile he had worn in many years. They continued walking. Sophie's small figure led the way, upright like a tiny general, guiding her blind soldier as they disappeared into the darkness and cold rain of New York. What do you think? Are Sophie and Thomas truly safe in this harsh world? Or is the trial only the beginning of greater challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more thrilling psychological stories to come.